Chap here. Welcome once again to the workshop. Now, before we start, all these that you see before you are not for sale. So bots, jog on. Anyway, back to business. This is the third episode on Beloved Rubies. Now, this is pretty much a public service video, not something we do often, sort of videos on request. We like to do videos on things that interest us, and if they interest you, all the better. But in this case, I have a lot of requests. I seem to have become the internet Ruby guy for some reason. And I get a lot of requests from both the English-speaking and the Francophone audience about how to disassemble a Ruby. I think maybe there's a generational change at the moment. People inheriting grandfathers, great-grandfathers' houses, and these seem to be turning up in chests of drawers, in walls, in attics, in cellars, all over the place. And usually they've been stored, they've been neglected, so they need a good complete disassembly and a good clean to get them back at least up to, say, functioning, if not to firing safe condition. And people get stuck on disassembly. Thankfully, they're not complicated, but as I'm sure you know, these were made by a vast amount of manufacturers according to a very loose specification. So potentially there is a lot of slightly different variations on how the pistols are put together. So I've gone through the ones I have, identified, let's say, the common features, how to deal with them, and then I can also show you a couple of exceptions to the rules and how to deal with those. As I said, there's nothing really complicated. I'm going to need a screwdriver and two punches and a rubber hammer, and that's it. So there's no specialist tools needed, but hopefully after this, everyone will be able to disassemble them and restore them, or at least stabilize them for many, many, many decades, centuries to come. All right, before we begin, perhaps a quick round of applause to my two sacrificial rubies here. As you can well imagine, I have been practicing my assembly and disassembly in preparation for this video, and I really didn't want to do that over and over again on the rubies that have a nice finish. Luckily, I've got these two beaters which I can practice on and scratch and ding as much as I like. The external finish is well and truly gone, and there's nothing much worse I can do. But they are actually still fully functional. The bores are good, and they feed and fire just fine. But for the purposes of a demonstration, these are great. We have actually here a genuine Ruby, which underwent a partial restoration attempt. I think they've belt sanded the slide, and it's got pitting everywhere and everything. I do have a nice genuine Ruby, but we won't be tinkering with that one. We'll do everything on this one. And I've got also the Franken Ruby from the first video. This is a Asmendi Zuliaka, if I remember rightly, which has this curious sort of half-finished barrel and what looks like a fitting for a skeleton stock. So maybe it had a past life as a poacher's gun or something. But both of these have most of the common features, and I'll pull a couple of the other ones out that have a couple of different variations on the general theme. And all we're going to use for disassembly are some drift punches, nominal 2mm and 3mm. The actual dimensions are 1.6 and 2.6 millimeters respectively. Might have to resort to a rubber hammer, screwdriver if necessary. Generally, the only screws on these are actually the grip screws. Only on the Ruby here is there actually screws for further disassembly. We'll get to that in a second. So usually the first thing that we do is remove the slide, and this is the same on all Rubies. Simply apply the safety, which is also the slide stop, rotate the barrel out, rotate it back to the center, and then you pull it out. All you've done is pull these locking lugs out of connection with the frame, and then you pull it out, and then you can release the safety and the slide just moves off. And here is the captive recoil spring assembly. Now that's normally what should happen, But in quite a number of cases, and this is one of the reasons why I made the first troubleshooting video, you try and do it. So you remove the barrel, and then you can't get any further. Now, in most cases, what's happened is that the hammer in the cocked position is sitting too proud of the frame, and it's catching on the inside of the back of the slide. And if you're lucky, you can actually just sort of slingshot it by putting back the slide, which is a pretty chunky piece of metal, and ensure you've got a nice soft landing for it, and you just fire it forward effectively using the recoil spring, and it'll ride over. As you can see, this one, it's quite high, and the slide sort of rides over, pushes it down, and you can disassemble it. You can disassemble it. You can disassemble it that way. Another way of doing it is simply with a bit of brute force. So if we do that again, like that, simply rubber hammer and just force the issue like that. Now, if it still doesn't work, because sometimes the shape of the hammer at the back is really quite square, so it's not going to ride over it. One solution, as I showed in the vid, was to disassemble the spring magazine catch here, which also retains the main spring for the hammer, and then this allows, once the spring's not there, the hammer simply drops down to its lowest position, and then it's clear of the slide. That's the long way. But since then, I developed a little alternative, which is this unremarkable looking piece of aluminium, but any hard material will do, even hard wood would do. This would have to be made, custom made for your particular pistol. There's no general dimensions, and effectively what you're going to do is just got the slide there, and then you've got this gap here in the slide where the hammer snaps up when firing, and I'm going to drop this wedge inside like this. I've got a slanted face here, which is going to go in the back slanted portion here, and like so. I'm putting it on the side because I want it out of the way of the ejector on the frame. So I've got it here on the side, and that's going to push down the hammer as I push the slide forward. This focuses, there we go. So this notch here is where the extractor goes from the slide, so obviously this can't go in the way, otherwise they will collide. So I loose the frame again, the slide again, there, just ease it forward. You can see it's pushing down, and then I just finish off, and there we go, and that just falls out. Usually it just falls out of the mag well. So that is a quick fix. It means you don't have to fight the mainspring, which is in there, but as I said, there's no point giving you dimensions. Just get the gist of what's happening effectively. If I get this in position, what's happening is as the slide goes forward, it's going to push down on the hammer as the slide gets pushed forward. So this is all this thing does, but it saves a bit of time. Alright, so we've got the slide off. Now what do we need to remove from here? Well, there's actually only two things we can physically remove. There is the extractor and the firing pin. Now the extractor is always retained by a vertical pin that goes through the frame, and you can access it inside here. The same there. There's the other end of the pin down there. But the firing pin itself can be retained in, as I've found, three ways. So in this case we have a screw. This is the ruby. If I can get it through, it's a tiny little grub screw which has been much abused. we go. Let's freed it sufficiently. And there is the firing pin with its little spring. Very simple firing pin. They seem to be all of this kind of configuration. Just the length of the slot will vary. So this is how that one's, this is how it's retained in that one. In this one, we've got nothing here. No screw in here either. That's some machining marks there. And in fact, this firing pin is retained by an extension of the extractor. See if I can do that just by pushing it, because I've done it so many times. Yep, there you go. So here is the extractor. It's got this little claw here sticking out, and that is what fits in the notch of the firing pin, like this. So the firing pin can move backwards and forwards, but it's retained by this little claw here. So that is the main, well, that's the second way. And of course there is a little tiny spring in here for the extractor, so that it can pivot in to engage the cartridge rim. And the other way, you can see here, is simply having a pin that extends through the slide, and again it'll enter a slot, so the firing pin is in this condition now, this position in there, so the firing pin can move. And the only other variation I have on that is this pistol here, which is other Zuliaka, a different Zuliaka than this one, and this has the pin transverse in the slide, so the firing pin has its cutout towards the top of the frame. So those are the three retaining patterns I've found for the firing pin. And just to complicate things, here is an Izaha pistol. If you look at the top, there's two pins. So, okay, you think one for the extractor and one for the firing pin. So this one's clearly for the extractor. This one should be for the firing pin, but it's too far forward, and also it's too far off the center line to actually engage a slot in the firing pin. So when I disassembled this, I found that this is actually a pin that does absolutely nothing. I don't know whether it was a manufacturing error and they accidentally drilled a hole in the wrong place and plugged it, or I don't know, aesthetics, who knows. In fact, the firing pin is retained, as in this one, by the extractor. Let's move on to the frame, and here there's all sorts of things we can take apart. The ejector is a separate part, you can see there, and it's pinned in place. There's one pin here and one pin there. So you can replace it, say for example if the nose snapped off, you could drift these pins out and put in a new one. But clearly it's not something that you can do very easily. These have all been finely machined off to be nice and flat on the inside as well. So it's not something that's intended to be removed quickly. And they all seem to follow more or less the same pattern, just the location of the pins is a bit different. So this one's got a smaller pin here and the other one's back here. And of course there's the exception that confirms the rule. We go back to the Izara pistol, and here we have a clearly removable ejector. So it's a separate piece that's keyed in to the slide, and we have a nicely easily accessible cross pin which we can hammer out with a punch. So they chose the way of an easily replaceable ejector. We'll concentrate on the trigger mechanism in particular. The first thing we're going to remove is the safety lever. So there is a little slot in the frame, we can just see there, the angle of which depends on the model. There's a bit of freedom of angle, and there is a little nub on the axis of the lever, and you just have to match up with the little notch here. Now this is actually just biased by the recoil spring, so when that's in place and under tension, it acts on some flats on the lever, and that biases it between the disengaged and engaged position. So we just rotate that until it pops out. There we go. There you can see the slot, and that's the axis of the safety lever. That's the flats against which the spring pushes, the guide rod pushes, and that's the little nub there that prevents the safety lever from falling out unless it's in the disassembly position. You can't get it into the disassembly position when the grips are in place. So there, they did make sure they couldn't accidentally pull it out. What you can see here is the disconnector. It's a very simple disconnector. As the slide rides over it, it just pushes down on this and it disconnects the trigger bar from the sear. Very, very easy, used in many other pistols. So we're going to remove the trigger assembly, trigger bar, and there we just need to remove this pin here. So let's do that. Pin, and when this is out of the way, we can just also slide out the disconnector. That's also keyed into a slot, and then we can just pull out the trigger assembly. Bit of a fiddle, you have to just pull it out to the side, and you can see in the frame there's a cutout that goes all the way through the frame here. So very easy to machine, and that's the whole trigger assembly here. There's a little spring plunger inside, and you won't see it in there, but that's pushing down on the trigger bar here so that it's always tries to engage with the sear. I'm not going to remove this because it's a pain to put it back together, but you get the gist. If you want to remove it completely, you just remove this pin and then you've got access to the spring plunger. So of my 16 rubies, 14 of them disassemble the way I've just shown you. To my surprise, when making this video, I discovered that the Ruby has a slightly different disassembly and a slightly different arrangement of the trigger mechanism. So once again, I'm not sacrificing this one. We'll go back to this train wreck. So the first clue what I had was there's a screw here. What's that doing there? And secondly, the recoil spring here is gone, but the trigger safety is still biased. And indeed, down here is a blind hole. It's not pushing down on the shaft of the safety. So something weird going on. So this bit clearly is the same, but there's something strange going on here. So this took a little bit of work to figure out, because the first thing I would have to do is remove the trigger safety. And actually it turns out that in terms of disassembly it's pretty much the same as the other ones. So you need to find the position where where you can pull it out. Big clue, as with the others, it's in a position that you can't reach with the grips on. So in this case it turns out to be just when it's opposite the hinge pin of the trigger. So like that. And I just push on the other side and give it a bit of a wiggle. Let's pull it out. That's what he said. There we go. So here we see there's a little spring plunger. So that's what's biasing the shaft here. You can see it's a little more complex machining than is on the other one, which just had two flats milled in it. So what you're doing when you're putting this in disassembly position is you're putting the solid surface, the ungrooved surface of the shaft, level facing the plunger there, and then you can push out the shaft. So far so good. Now what we're going to do is remove the disconnector. It just slides over, as you can see there, because I need a little bit of space to move the trigger bar. So it just slides over. And now, oh yes, the other hint, but we can't see with the light, but there is no cut through the back or the front of the magwell to the trigger guard. So through here, the trigger cannot pass. There's just a little slot for the transfer bar. That's it. So that was another hint that something was a bit odd. So this one's got a little more complex machining rather than just putting a milling tool down there and hollowing everything out. So now I've got some room to wiggle the trigger bar. I lift it up at the trigger end and you can see it hooked in. Next we're going to have to remove the spring plunger here, and we have to remove this little screw, another grub screw of questionable quality. And then we can use a screwdriver just to tease out the spring plunger. There it comes. It's double-ended. There's a plunger at each end. Now we can remove the pin. Wrong one. And now we can just lever out the trigger. So here is the trigger. We have the trigger bar that sits on a little pin there. So it's hooked in like so. And we have this spring plunger which comes on top. And once everything is tensioned up and the top of the spring plunger here is being pressed down by the safety lever, this functions just like the other version here. So two different approaches to the same mechanism. It depends whether you mill out a huge chunk of the frame or not. But I thought this solution was pretty clever. Self-contained, also means you can separate the elements easily. So maybe it was slightly more complex to make, which is probably why the rest didn't go with it. Probably also slightly more difficult to machine the frame to fit this kind of mechanism. Right, time to talk about another exception, and no, the Izara is not to blame. This concerns the disconnector, and normally you can see it from the outside. So there's a gap between the grips and the slide, and you can see the top of the disconnector blade here, which is all well and good until I came across this one, the Arcaltasuna. This I think is probably my best in terms of build quality. It's also much heavier than the others, but it really is built like a tank. But here there's no evidence of any disconnector, but clearly there's something going on. So remove the grip, and there I discovered that there has a slightly different, so an extra part between the sear and the trigger bar here. Very clever little thing. So it's pivoting relative to both elements, and so the trigger bar here pushes on this little step there, and as it pivots, its front surface here is also pushing down on the trigger bar. And if we cock it, basically it reaches a point where it pivots the plate just enough to disengage the sear from the hammer, and at the same time the over travel disconnects the two pieces and releases the sear back to engage the hammer for the next shot. There you go. Hammer's fired and the two are disconnected. So here with the hammer is not cocked, it's just tripping it without doing anything. So that's a really, really clever system. I can just hear you now saying, but Chappie, you didn't disassemble all the gubbins in here. Well, to be honest, I did it already in the second vid, but in the interest of science and perhaps entertainment, I will do so by illustrating perhaps the worst thing that you could possibly do when reassembling one of these. But first, allow me to get a bit of Dutch courage, because you have no idea how many times I've done this, either because I messed it up or I messed up the dialogue. So hopefully this round will be a good one. Proost. So you have disassembled your Ruby, cleaned it, everything, reassembled the frame, ready to put the slide back on. And you, for some reason or other, perhaps after imbibing a few too many of your favourite libations, you put in this assembly in backwards. This will still make the safety lever work, but of course when you put the slide on, you get stuck because the bigger end of the recoil spring guide doesn't fit through the hole in the slide. And if you're lucky and the hammer is nicely flush with the top of the frame, or just protruding a little bit, you can force it over, like in this one. It's a little bit proud, but you can just push it over, or you can smack it with a rubber mallet. You can't slingshot the slide because you can't pull it back. And as has been emailed to me a couple of times, even worse, which is not the case here, if you can pull the trigger. Now this doesn't work on this one because the little cutout in the slide which allows the disconnector to go fully up isn't aligned yet, because the slide isn't fully into battery, so pulling the trigger does nothing. But let's assume that we can. Let's just trip the trigger. This works. It may not work because the back of the slide is still covering the hammer, which, yeah, this is the case. So, but apparently on some models they have then been able to pull the trigger, and then the hammer is sitting vertically up inside the slide, and then there's no way of forcing the slide forward. And in that case, the only option you have is to disassemble everything in here so that the hammer can drop down into the recess of the frame, and then you can put the slide forward. So let us do this in the interest of science. So it starts off with simply the pin holding the magazine catch. Sometimes you can get lucky and that is all you need to do. It's under a lot of spring tension, so I'm going to relieve that a little bit with my little clamp here. And then gently release it. Pock, out it goes. Very rusty spring, but still works. I'll oil that before I reassemble it. And then you can, if you want, just release the sear, and then you can see the hammer has dropped, and then you're clear. Now this pin here is actually the hammer stop, so it's a big chunky pin which is here, which prevents the hammer from over traveling forward. There's no reason to remove this. You can, but it's just a pin, there's nothing else there. But we'll go the whole hog, and I'll show you the sear as well, just in case you haven't seen it before. So that is just another pin you need to drift out. And that is what the sear looks like. Very, very simple. It's got a little section of coil spring in the back to bias it in the catching position. So I misidentified the hammer stop here. It's not this one here. It is actually this one that's slightly concealed here. Some of them are more visible than others. This is, of course, the axis pin for the hammer. So let's go all the way and remove that too. No secrets here. And that is the hammer. They have different shapes. This one seems to be the one sort of special shape for the rubies. The other one has exactly the same, so a short, stubby little hammer. Most of them just tend to be a sort of rectangular block. So there we go. And yeah, reassembly is pretty much the same thing, but backwards. So there you go. I've shown you all the secrets of my Ruby pistols. As I said, there's probably more variations out there. If there are, let me know in the comments. And yeah, if you come across one of these in the future, or you have one which is being particularly stubborn with disassembly, hopefully now you can get to grips with it. There's very little that can go wrong with these things. The only unfortunate thing maybe is perhaps that the parts are mostly not interchangeable, so if you do break something or something's missing, you're probably better off getting it made from scratch. Get some basic measurements maybe from someone for the part, and then it's going to be a hand-fit job. So thank you very much for watching. Thank you very much for following us on whatever platform you wish to choose, and I'll see you very soon out there on the range or back here in the workshop for some grubby hands-on stuff. Bye!